it's really easy to quit, right? Like that's the easy way out. But if you have a group of people that are pushing you and encouraging you, then you're more likely to stay there. I know that's definitely true for me.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Unstuck. I'm your host, Justin Michaelet, a writer at Gumroad, where I deconstruct the tactics, strategies, and processes of top creators. Each week on the podcast, I interview creators and digital entrepreneurs who are at the top of their fields. On this week's episode, I interviewed EDUpreneuer and Chief Evangelist at Synthesis, Lorena Fabrega, Miss Fab. Anna and I talked about her journey since leaving a traditional career path 2 years ago, how she started the flywheel and went from $0 to $1 on the internet, her early decision to join a creative community, David Perell's Rite of Passage course, how she's created her own professional luck, and the deliberate approach she's taken to designing her life. We covered a lot of ground. We also talked about learning, her work at Synthesis School, and a recent milestone at the company, the similarities between creators and the way kids solve problems, and how the best creators are willing to look foolish repeatedly. Finally, we talked about what it means to find your game and to take a game-based approach to lifelong education. This was a fantastic and inspiring conversation. I'm so pleased we had Anna as our inaugural guest on Unstuck. This one will make you want to create and share your ideas publicly. Enjoy. Our guest today is Lorena Fabrega, Miss Fab herself. Thank you for being here, Anna.
Thank you, Justin, for having me.
And welcome to Unstuck. This is our inaugural episode of our new podcast from Gumroad that coincides with our universal rebrand. So we were proud to roll that out on Friday, 11/26/2021, Cyber Friday. So it's just great to have you here. You took a risk in 2019, stepping away from a career that had a traditional career path. And since then, over the past 2 years, you've sort of designed your own lifestyle. And so that's what I wanted to dive into today, how you unstuck yourself from that traditional career path. And then I'm a sucker for the creative process. So I'd love to talk about how you unstick yourself as a part of that process. So again, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, I really love this topic. And, now in retrospect, looking at the past 2 years, it's been a very exciting ride, full of ups and downs. And I'm happy to share about it because I know that a lot of people are sort of going through the same thing, similar, different ways. But yeah, so I was an educator. I was a teacher for many years. Since I was little, I had this desire to work with kids, and I had sort of a natural way of explaining things in ways that captured people's attention, or so my parents would tell me. And so I was really inclined to study education. I went through my college years doing that, and then I worked at different schools around the world. I actually went to 10 different schools myself when I was growing up because I moved around a lot. So I got a really interesting inside look of how schools work. And although I was really passionate about the whole teaching and learning and working with kids, I couldn't help but notice all the discrepancies within the system and how things hadn't changed in many years and how we were not really using kids' time productively or preparing them for, the kind of creative jobs that they were going to have in the future. We're really teaching them how to think. But I didn't really know what to do about it, right? So I just sort of sucked it up for the first few years until it got to the point where I was like, this doesn't really make sense for me anymore. I don't want to keep enforcing things that I don't truly believe in, but I want to find a better way, or at least start meeting people that are thinking about education sort of the way that I was thinking about it and see where that could take me. So I finally quit teaching in 2019, and I had no idea what I was going to be doing next. I was sort of like, I definitely don't want to apply to a different school because I had been, again, as a student in many different schools, and then as a teacher in New York, Panama, and Boston, and also different kinds of schools. And even the most progressive ones, it just felt more of the same. So I was like, well, what do I do now? And I remember my husband being like, well, why don't you activate your Twitter account again and just sort of start exploring? There's some interesting people like Naval Ravikant at the time and David Perell who were talking about this new concept of the creator economy. And particularly David Perell, who's he's self-proclaimed writing guy. I remember thinking, well, what is this guy doing? He was launching this course that he called Rite of Passage that sort of promised that it would teach you how to become a citizen of the internet, how to write for modern times, and how to start that process of, like building your online persona. And I was like, well, this sounds interesting. Let's see what happens. I mean, at this point, I don't really know where else am I going to meet people that are like-minded and that are probably thinking about the things that I'm thinking about. So I took the course, and that was sort of the first time that it opened my eyes to this world out there, all this virtual world. And there were a lot of people in this course that were not from the same background as, like, not really educators, but from different fields that were also trying to get unstuck, like the podcast name. They were trying to they felt like, their current jobs weren't really fulfilling, that they had more to offer, but they didn't really know where to start, what to do about it. So through that process, I started meeting really interesting people. Like I said, I activated my Twitter account where I found that it was an intellectual hub of ideas, really interesting people just sharing for free all their knowledge. And I started writing, which I really never considered myself a writer prior to that, especially since I was teaching kids how to write the traditional way, and my background had been very traditional. So
can I interject with a few questions? Just want to solicit from you a few data points on the chronology, and then on how many people were in that cohort with you when you joined Rite of Passage, how many people, roughly speaking, you had as part of your Twitter audience at that time. I want you to put us in your shoes. Oftentimes, it's hard even for you to look back and understand where you were at that exact moment. And I think people may be surprised that you might not have written all that much and published it online at that moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, those are great questions. I'm glad that you asked. So this was November 2019. So I had just quit teaching and had just discovered this guy, David Pearl, on Twitter. And there were 200 people in the course. It was the third time that he was doing this cohort-based online course. And there were people from all over the world. And like I said, different fields. I think that I was the only educator from that cohort. And they varied different ages and, again, different backgrounds. And they were all sort of like in the same boat, trying to find something different and trying to get unstuck, and with the hope that writing and meeting an online community would sort of like help them in that process. And so at the beginning, when I reactivated my Twitter account, and I had probably less than 200 followers back then. And then the people that were following me were mostly the people in the cohort, which is a wonderful thing, because there are many ways to go by this journey. I'm going to talk about the way that I did it and the things that worked for me. It doesn't necessarily mean it works for everyone, but one of the biggest things in this journey was like finding that community, that initial community of people that were going to help you sort of, because at the beginning, when you start putting things out there and creating content, you're really speaking to crickets, right? Like nobody's really there. And it's a little frustrating at first. But when you start at a place like Rite of Passage, where you have this community, and I know that there are different communities out there nowadays, but they're all starting sort of at the same level, and we're all helping each other and sort of like retweeting our ideas and giving each other feedback. And then you start to sort of meet people through the actual platform. So that's what happened to me. I started first with the people in the cohort in Rite of Passage. And then I actually started interacting with the people that started following me on Twitter. And it was super interesting because they open up to their audience, and then suddenly you have access to the people that they're working with. And I started meeting just really, really interesting people. And so at the time, so I'll go a little bit back as well. I had never really published anything ever. And I had really that fear. I was like, well, who's going to want to hear my ideas? I'm just a teacher. I have all these ideas about what education could be like, but who am I? And what's going to differentiate my work from what other educators are writing about and are putting out there? And then I came across this concept. Different people call it different things, but David calls it in his course, your personal monopoly, which is where I think that this is really what helped me get like unstuck from this period in my life, that he calls it sort of like that intersection of the three things that make you unique or make your content unique, right? Which is what you're really passionate about, what you're really good at, and then what the world is willing to pay for, right? What service you can provide that people will pay for. Naval Ravikant, for example, has a very similar concept called specific knowledge. He talks about like the unique combination of your DNA, your unique upbringing, and then sort of your response to it. So it's sort of baked into your personality. And then once you find what that is, then you hone in it. And I remember reading one of his quotes that, and I'm going to I don't remember it out of the top of my head, but it was something like, the internet has massively opened up the space for careers out there. You just have to find what your niche and be very, very good at it, like be the best at what you do. And so I was like, well, how am I going to find this? And I started reflecting. Writing was a big part of my process and sort of like a key way for me to continue learning and sort of like being face to face with my sloppy ideas and where I needed to sort of like do more research and learn more. And so I started writing sort of my thoughts. And then the really hard part, which was starting to share online, right? And everyone struggles with this. I remember the course, everyone's like, what? Like, I need to start a newsletter. Who's going to read that? That means I'm putting myself out there. I need to start publishing my thoughts on Twitter, on my blog. It was even though you had a very small audience at the time, it's hard, right? It's hard to put yourself out there because you're exposing yourself and you're exposing your ideas. But you quickly learn that places like Twitter, for example, are amazing for feedback. Like, I would put some thoughts out there and then I could tell what would click with people, what people thought was interesting, and then where I would receive pushback. That got me thinking and got me refining my ideas. So I started to learn, I had to unlearn a few things, right? For example, in school, they teach you, and I talk a lot about this, like this fear of failure. And if, oh my gosh, if I put myself out there and it's not good. But then when you start to realize as you go through this process, again, for me, was through a course. Some people just do it independently. Is that you need to be willing to be wrong a lot before you can actually experience what it's like to be right. And even when you feel like you're right, you need to understand that your ideas are always under construction. And here's where putting yourself out there is amazing, because you keep getting feedback. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative, but it helps you, refine your ideas. And so that was just a really crucial part of my process, just, sort of like losing that fear of putting myself out there. And I never expected this, but, I never thought that anyone other than my mom and my dad and maybe my husband would subscribe to my newsletter. But then I started to see that every week I would, have people subscribing and sharing my writing. And then suddenly my Twitter following started to grow and I could see people sharing my write-ups. And I was like, wow, like there's a place here for the things that I'm talking about. But then I started, as part of the process, to sort of like run out of ideas. And I started to notice that I was sort of being inclined to think of the traditional things that educators talk about and this and that. And I was like, no, well, what do I do to sort of like break this habit? I want to keep being interesting. I want to keep raising interesting questions that get people thinking in a new way. And so I started reading and learning about topics that had nothing to do with education. And this was a very crucial moment for me because I was getting stuck again. Even though I was sort of like gaining momentum and starting to put my things and getting traction, it did get to a point where I was running out of interesting ideas. And even I wasn't really interested in writing about the topics that I had in mind. But then when I started to sort of like learn about things that had nothing to do with education, not the typical things that people are writing, and just try to look at it through the lens of a child, but that could also be applicable to grown-ups and adults, then that's when my writing started to get really interesting. And that's when I started to sort of hone into this personal monopoly or specific knowledge. And so I started putting my thoughts, and it was mostly, again, books that had nothing to do with education. And then I realized something really interesting. I grew up thinking, we talk about the creator economy and this and that, but I never thought of myself as a creative person. Especially like my mom is a very creative person, but she's a very artistic. So she's a dancer, she paints, she sculpts, she sings and all this. And I wasn't really like that, although I did dance. But other than that, I was like, well, I'm not really creative, but I was sort of confusing the term creative with artsy, right? And there are many, many ways that you can be creative. And I thought, well, I'm starting this whole journey where I need to keep coming up with ideas that are original, and I need to come up with like new insights that have never been shared before. And then I was like, wait, not really. Nowadays, there's so much information, right? We have information abundance, and there's so many people putting their thoughts out there. Really, what's sort of like missing, or a piece that people really appreciate nowadays, is this curation idea, right? People who are able to grab really interesting ideas and sort of distill them in interesting ways, in ways that are, engaging, but also in making it simple to understand. And sort of, so I kept thinking, well, maybe I can grab these ideas that I find fascinating and sort of like give my lens and sort of like the way I view it through the lens of a kid, but applicable to adults, but also just making it simple and trying to explain them as if I were talking to a child, like if a child could understand the things that I'm talking about. And that started to really work. And I realized, well, this is a form, like this is a way of being creative, right? I'm not necessarily coming up with a completely new idea myself, but I am synthesizing and grabbing the best and then curating the content and putting it out there with my twist and sort of like in an engaging way. And that started to work out really well. And I started to notice that the people around me that were doing really well in the course had also sort of discovered that trick, right? But then you sort of fall into like some people sort of be like, Anna, how can you continue every week coming up with stuff? Like I've sort of come to like a point where I just don't know what to write about. And then I realized that, and I think Naval also talks a lot about this, like you need to find something that you're irrationally passionate about, right? Something, because otherwise you're going to get tired of it and you're not going to want to wake up every day and write about it. And, and for me, I am very passionate about all these topics that I cover and the things that I talk about. Like I'm always thinking about this and it fuels me, it gives me energy, and you can sort of transmit that through your work, right? And the internet really rewards people that are genuine and that are authentic in that sense. So you don't have to have all the answers and you don't have to put out something that's perfect. You just have to acknowledge that, again, your ideas are under construction, but just be very genuine, and that comes through your work. And so it all comes down to this idea of the personal monopoly and the specific knowledge. It took me about, a year and a half where I kept refining and refining and refining until I found and I think it keeps evolving, right? Like now it's sort of like gamified education and teaching through games and the creator economy and like putting out your ideas and all this, but it keeps changing, it keeps evolving, and that's okay. That's part of it. And so I think it was the beginning of, sort of mid last year. So in June 2020, that's when people started to reach out to me for the first time. And that's when I realized, oh my gosh, maybe I don't ever have to apply to a job again, right? At this point, I've been writing for, it was probably a few months, like not a year yet, but my body of work kept compounding, and it would be shared overnight while I was sleeping, and people will keep sharing, and as long as I woke up every morning and wrote something and shipped my work, then it kept compounding, and I was going to keep growing. Not everything was great, right? Some did better than others, but it was just the habit of just waking up every day and putting in the reps and just trusting that it was going to take me somewhere. And at the beginning, I wasn't monetizing anything, and it was just sort of trusting the process, right? But then people started to reach out. They wanted to talk to me. They had seen my writing. I realized I never have to send a CV or a resume ever again in my life. Like my website speaks for itself. My write-ups speak for themselves. And well, I don't know if you want for me to get into synthesis where I'm now, but basically.
I do, but let me ask a follow-up question, or rather two.
And interrupt me anytime. Otherwise, I'll just keep on talking.
No, what you articulated very well were your way of working through 3 or 4, what I would call sticking points, sticking with the theme here. And so you described those sticking points and how you were able to resolve them. But I want to not gloss over the fact that there's this interregnum period, this intermediary period where it's very difficult. So for example, just yesterday, I happened to be looking up a concept that I thought David Perell had tweeted about at some point. So I just used Twitter search, and one result came up back in 2014. And David had tweeted this very smart thing that exactly 0 people liked and 0 people engaged with a comment. And it made me think he'd been doing that for months, shouting directly into the void. And so I guess that gets to my point, which is, yes, what you said initially was you get feedback, but really you don't in the very earliest stage. And that then connects to the idea of irrational passion and what it is that you are intensely curious about. So clearly it was for you having a half a decade of immersion in education, and specifically childhood education, that clearly wasn't a one-off fleeting, flash in the pan interest. That was something that you deeply resonated with after, moving to 10 different schools and so forth. So that's one thing I wanted to get to, is just to have you take yourself back there where no one was engaging with your stuff. Why did you keep putting out a newsletter every single week, and how did you do that? So that's like point number 1. And then I'll let you answer that. And then I have a question on this concept of if you're going to unstick yourself multiple times, perhaps one way of doing that is finding what sticks. So what are those things that stuck for you that then you doubled down around?
Oh, those are great questions. So for me, it was a little bit different answering the first question, like sort of what kept me going, because I made the decision to join a community in order to go through this process. And so again, there are different ways to go through this. Some people just do it individually. And I think that those are the people that really, really struggle at the beginning. Like David, for example, he hadn't created Rite of Passage back in 2014. So he was just talking to the empty space, right? I actually started from a place where, again, I was with other 200 folks that were going through the same thing. And we were all sort of, so I would always have at least one like, or at least one comment, or at least one pushback from the people in the Rite of Passage community. So that's why when people reach out to me and they're like, Anna, I want to start this journey. Like, what do I do? I was like, well, the first thing you should find your tribe, right? Or your community. And that could be through an online course. That could be maybe you and a few folks that you already know. If you can find someone, like, for example, for me, it was, David already had an audience. And I, in addition to being a student in his course, we became really good friends. And we started doing some things on the side. So when he would help me out, right? Whenever he would tweet about me or write something or retweet my stuff, he had a way bigger account. So that would sort of help me get more traction, right? So that obviously always helps. Not everyone has access to that. But yeah, starting in a community and having people that have already gone through a similar process, I think is a huge help, because they will give you some of the tips. They will help you out when you get stuck with, even if it's words of encouragement or actually actionable things that you can do. But then also the people that are around you they want to help you, right? Because you're helping them back. And it's sort of like, so I did have that help from the people there, and they would retweet or share my stuff. And even though they had small audiences, other people would see it, right? So that was really helpful for me, if that answers your question. So definitely find like that group of people. And then not only that, but also, of course, there were weeks where I was like, I'm giving up. Like, this is not for me. There's no way that I can keep up the habit of writing every week. And then, on top of that, I was like, I want to start doing videos. And I was like, what? Like, there's no way. Like, I cannot do this. But then because I was, again, part of a community, the people would help me out. They would, share their experience. I would see that I wasn't the only one struggling. And, I would read a lot of the work from James Clear and how he talks about the power of habits and of showing up every day and putting in those reps and the power of compounding. So really not get like, you need to be able to see long term and trust that if you show up every day, you will get there. Like, I really believe that. I really believe that anyone who has a strong interest or passion for something and that's willing to put in the work every day and put it on top of everything, they will be able to make a living out of that, even if they don't have a degree on the field. Like, I really believe that. I've seen it through multiple people. The thing is, it's hard in those moments where you get stuck. It's really easy to quit, right? Like, that's the easy way out. But if you have a group of people that are pushing you and encouraging you, then you're more likely to stay there. I know that's definitely true for me. So hopefully that answers the first question.
Yes, it does. And you triggered for me one of the things that you said very early on in this conversation. You made a passing reference to the fact that people are born creators, and you struggled at times with the definition of creator or to be creative or what even that means. And I think you and I have violent agreement on the fact that every human is inherently creative. Just look at any 5-year-old kid. I have a 6-year-old. You've taught people from kindergarten all the way through what I think you like 9 and 10, third, fourth grade.
Fifth grade. Yeah, all the way to fifth.
Yeah. So all you have to do is merely interact with a person that age for 10 minutes and you realize everyone is creative in a way. And I think a lot of people conflate the creative act, as you said, maybe with art, high art, something like that, when in fact it can mean anything that is published, anything that you create and put out into the world. And I think maybe it's a non sequitur to simply say that I agree with you on that point.
No, absolutely. Well, I speak to a lot of my friends because obviously, as I've seen everything that has happened in the past 2 years for me, I want this for the people around me as well. especially for those that are unhappy in their current jobs. They have corporate jobs like 8 to 5, and they're just not happy with what they're doing. And I'm a true believer that, even if it's a side project or a side gig, like, you should be building something under your name. I really, really believe that, and creating leverage for yourself. So, and again, I understand that some people just can't leave their jobs, but they can sort of like start this journey where they sort of put their thoughts out. But the part of sharing is so important. And it's because a lot of my friends are like, no, we're doing all the work, but we're just not sharing. Like, we're just skipping that step. And it's like, no, that is really the most important part, because that's when the magic starts happening, right? And at the beginning, like, again, some people, you won't get a lot of traction, but if you keep doing it eventually and you keep refining and finding that niche, you will hit, like, the internet is huge, right? You will find a group of people that are interested in your things, especially if you're incorporating the feedback. So absolutely.
Yeah. Something like 1/10 of 1/100th of 1% of the internet is 4,000 people or something like that. So it's a
Crazy.
rather large space. One of the things that you described at the very end of your response to the first question was the idea of finding a full-time, or maybe it's not even full-time for you, but a centering role in your life of work or your professional life. And you mentioned synthesis. And I believe that the way you found your way into the role of chief evangelist at Synthesis School is by putting yourself out there almost on, so you would say, I would say a high consistency, high quality way. And Chrisman found you, I believe, without your reaching out to him. Can you describe that?
Yeah, which is one of the wildest stories to me, because again, I had quit my job and I decided to take this route, but I could have very well been like, well, I'll just apply to a different school. I'm moving to Miami. Like, I'm just going to apply to schools there. But I was like, no, I'm so glad I didn't do that. Because when I started writing, like I said, different ed tech startups and different people started to reach out that they wanted to talk. And some of them were really interesting conversations. Some of them I was like, oh, this is more of the same. But I was just fascinated at the fact that, I didn't have to be looking for interesting people to talk to. Like, they were just finding me through my work. And one of those was Chrisman Frank, who's the CEO and one of the founders at Synthesis, the startup where I work now. And, the company was still in stealth mode. It was him and Josh Don, the other co-founder, and they had this idea, but they were looking for somebody like me, like an independent journalist in the space that had sort of like an audience around education and alternative education that aligned philosophically with them. And he had been following me on Twitter when I had like less than 200 followers, which is crazy, when I had just started like tweeting. And then he subscribed. He was one of my first subscribers to my newsletter. Even before like I knew about Synthesis, he had announced anything, nothing. So he had been following me, and he reached out and he's like, hey, I want to chat. I want to meet you. And this was December 2019. So I had just started my journey through Rite of Passage in November. So a month. And we talked maybe once or twice in a period of like 4 months or 5 months. And then the third time we talked, he's like, I really want to tell you about this interesting opportunity that I think goes perfectly with all the things that you're talking about. And so he introduced me, and I'm not going to go too deep into it, but it's like this idea of synthesis and this game-based school that they were coming up with. It was a spin-off of Ad Astra, the school of Elon Musk. And I was like, oh my gosh, he joined one of their simulations, completely obsessed with the product and with the vision of this company. And they were like, Anna, we've seen your work. You don't have to prove anything. Like, we've been following you for a while. We would love for you to join as part of the founding team. And they gave me the title, like the Chief Evangelist. I was like, well, what is that? And they're like, well, what you've been doing for the past year, right? Which is evangelizing the category and sort of raising the problems with the traditional school system, talking about what the future could look like, and then just sharing your excitement for, what we're doing. Would you want to be part of this? And I remember just being baffled. Like, I could not believe that I had found such a perfect fit for what I was doing. And at the time I had said, I don't want to work for anybody else. I already realized all the things that I can do by myself and just, with what I was doing. So I was like, I don't need to work for anybody. I don't need to apply to another job. However, I did want to find a group of people that were working on something that aligned with what I wanted to do. And I was so excited about this. And I was able to put my conditions. I was able to say, well, this is what I want to do. This is what I don't want to do. I want to keep on growing my brand. I want to keep on writing. I want to keep on sharing when I see other interesting ed startups that are doing cool things, because I know that it provides value to other parents. So I put all my conditions, and they were like, go for it. Sure. Do you want to join? And that was just incredible because for so many years, for the entire year and a half until this happened, which was November last year, 2020, I wasn't sure where this was going, but I would keep waking up every day and putting in the reps and trusting that it was going to get me somewhere. And that's the moment where it clicked. And I was like, wow, this is what creating leverage for yourself looks like, right? And there was no way that I was going to know if it was going to work or not, but I just kept going and I just trusted the process. And again, the community around me kept pushing me and I got really good feedback and sometimes not great feedback from my audience, but all feedback was great because it helped me, continue writing better ideas. And now here's where I am.
That's incredible. If I could build on that, that's incredible how you described the left-right limits that you gave Synthesis on the way in, and were upfront about the way you wanted to design your life. And at Gumroad, we talk a lot about enabling that sort of decision-making tree for creators who want to just design the way they live and the way they work and how those things marry together. By the way, you and I are among the few humans on Earth who have each held the title of evangelist for a tech company. I was an evangelist for a Silicon Valley company back in the day, so I understand the shoes that you're filling.
That is amazing.
And if I could add that a note of congratulations, I know that Synthesis is close to filling all of its cohorts across the board. I must make sure that my Teddy gets in to your latest cohorts before they fill up. And I would offer you the opportunity to talk about how close you are.
Yeah. So I was just talking to Chrisman right, before getting up this, and I think we have like 20 spots left, I believe he said. Yeah. So it all happened really quickly. And it's so exciting because I was, sitting here last year in November, literally when we launched, sending that first thread to the world, to sort of announce the start of Synthesis. Nobody had heard about it except for the three of us had been working on it. And it's, the fact that, a year later, I'm sitting here again, and now we've hit the point where it's filled up, and now we need to keep training facilitators so that we can keep opening up. We have a wait list. Like, it's just wild. It's just wild. And the way it happened, like, I don't know if you know the story, but we didn't really have a marketing team until I think it was like two or 3 months ago, max. Like, since the beginning of Synthesis all the way here, it had all been organic, coming through my audience, through my tweets, through my newsletter, through, and then that sort of like built momentum. And it talks again about what happens when you have a consistent body of work out there, for a while, and it speaks for yourself, and it has a lot of weight, right? And that's how sort of the company grew for a long time. And then it got to a point where it was like, okay, now we're ready to actually start, putting together a marketing team. But that to me is wild. Like, I never thought that this was even a possibility, right? So it really speaks to the power of online creators. I'm a big believer that this is, not only adding value, but it really works. It can change everything, everything. Like, not everything is perfect. No. And it's challenging every day. You need to keep coming up with things, and you need to keep, but it just really lets you, if you do it right and you stick around enough to sort of design the life that you want to have, right? I think that, I used to work, even on the weekends, and people know how hard teachers work. Like, it's not true that we're there 8 to 3. No, then we have to like prep for the next day. We're there until really late, then grading things and this and that. And I loved what I was doing, but there were so many restrictions, and I was just not enjoying other things. I didn't really have time for anything else. And then now I'm working probably as hard or even more, but it's in something that I'm really, really passionate about. Like, I wake up and my energy is different. Like, my attitude is different. And it's really changed everything for me. So I'm excited for people that are considering a similar route.
Yes, indeed. And if I could, I'd like to connect Synthesis to our broader conversation around creativity. And I think it's possible in the following sense. Synthesis, as I understand it, allows you to solve problems in the real world. And what I think I've come to understand is the biggest of the big ideas around education is not that it's a one-off thing that is all self-contained within your educational experience, K through 12, obviously. In today's day and age, you need to educate yourself, self-educate throughout your life. I kind of think it would be nice if all of us had Synthesis throughout our life. So the idea of solving problems, being creative, and sort of preparing yourself for the quote unquote real world. And you've had this wonderful tweet about how it's like follow instructions within the educational context traditionally. And life doesn't quote unquote give you rules, rather doesn't give you instructions or some instruction manual, but rather it's sort of fail, iterate, learn, so forth. So if you could, in maybe give us some synopsis of how synthesis could apply to all of us as creators.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's such a great question. So let me first sort of explain that particular part of synthesis that relates to the creative process. So, well, synthesis is basically a game-based approach to education, right? So we're teaching kids how to solve complex problems that mirror the problems in the real world, and we do it through these simulations where the kids get in and we don't tell them the rules. We don't tell them, what to do. They're sort of like thrown in there. We switch things constantly and the kids just have to figure it out. And at first, and by the way, these are very complex simulations, like the grown-ups now, synthesis has 39 full-time employees. We all play on Fridays, the games, because we need to keep up to date. And it's wild. Like we have our cohorts and it's just, it blows your mind that 8-year-olds and now 7-year-olds are actually doing this, right? So anyway, in order to solve the challenges and the problems that you get in the simulations, you need to get comfortable figuring things out for your own and sort of like dealing with it's very chaotic. Like everyone's sort of like, yelling, you're in teams trying to figure it out. And then you try something out and then you lose. And before you can even think, the game starts again. So you need to pick up on different things that are happening, but you really have to come up with your own strategies and ideas, test them out and see if they work. And then see how we've sort of like changed the game for the next round so that you can try again with a different strategy. So the kids are constantly coming up with their own ways to solve these problems. And it's so different from the way they do it in school. In school, we sort of like, the teacher already knows what the answer is. We know the process. And it's sort of like, we structure everything to the point where we're sort of like removing all the creativity from the process, right? Here, it's the opposite. And then the kids actually, as they go up, they get to, they pass to the next level. They get to actually design their own simulations and they get to come up, based on what they've learned and seeing what the kids like, that they get to come up with their own maps. And that's such an, cool part for the kids because it's the first time that they have like agency over their learning. They're like, wow, like here I actually get to call the shots. I get to decide what other kids are doing. And that really empowers them and engages them in ways that I've never seen in school or anything. And so I think it's this idea, trying to think how we can create it to creators. Like we're always, the creators, we don't know what's going to work and what's not. We may have a general idea, but it's not until we actually try it out and then see what sort of like sticks and then we pivot and then we try something new that we start to pick up on the patterns and the things that work, right? I fear that in school, kids don't really get that chance often where they get to actually try out different things and come up with creative solutions to problems. That's what we're trying to do at Synthesis. Give them that option and that, that space where they can do this over and over again. And the idea is that by going through this program for many years, they're constantly practicing this. They're sort of like giving room for their creativity to flourish and come up with different things. So by the time that they're 14, that they graduate from Synthesis, they're wired differently, right? It's sort of like that image that you showed about like that new process is the way that they think. And they sort of miss the best creators I've seen out there are the ones who are like, I'm going to try this out and I'm willing to look like a fool. Like it's probably going to happen and it's okay. Like it's fine. Like this is what's going to make me different from everyone else. And I'm going to look like a fool, but I'm going to keep on going. And I think that that's sort of like the attitude that we try to teach through the simulations. The fact that one, you can look at something that you've never seen before and you can teach yourself and you can learn it by giving it a try. And two, it's fine. You can look like a fool and you will lose and you will fail. And that's fine. That just means that you're closer. Now you have more information for the next time. And it's part of the learning process. So I think that that's sort of like part of the attitude that it teaches you.
Isn't it remarkable how you see a similar dynamic between the best problem solving 8-year-olds in Synthesis and the way that the best performing people are doing on Twitter? In other words, there's a very similar approach. It seems to me that the change that we're finding between, say, for example, Web 2 and Web 3 is head spinning, how fast things are moving and how things are changing. And yet the people that are succeeding through all these changes are the ones who can mentally adapt at speed and at scale to all of these things. It reminds me of some tweets from years ago. Tactics are about trying to win the game. Strategy is about trying to change the game. And grand strategy is about trying to win successive changed games. And it just seems like people who are crushing it are winning these successively changed games relentlessly. And I think you and I could name several people like that.
Absolutely. Which also, we talk a lot about the metagame at Synthesis, but the other thing that I realize is that everyone's sort of playing a different game, right? Life is all about games. We're all playing different games. They all look differently. Like there's the game of school, what you need to do in order to pass. There's like, we're all playing a different game. And it's a matter of finding like, what's that game that you're uniquely good at? And then just become the best at that game, right? But if you think about it through this lens, which I think that is sort of the attitude that we also try to inject for the kids as they go through the program, it's like, well, what's your game? What's your edge, right? And how can you get better at that? And looking through life through that lens is just really interesting. And yeah, I see so many similarities between creators, the ones that, have sort of like gone for it, and then kids, right? As kids grow and then they sort of go through the system, and then this ideology is getting played, then they sort of lose that. But then if we're able to preserve that, there's so many similarities between kids and creators and entrepreneurs, right? They just go for it. They're not scared of it. But then it's sad how we get trained out of that. I think that a lot of, I've spoken about this before, and I think I've tweeted about it a while ago, but the best creators out there and the best entrepreneurs and the most successful people that I've seen, they've done a lot of unlearning of the things that, they learned as kids and sort of like society has imposed on you. They've had to be like, no, let me unlearn, let me fresh start and try to do things differently. And I think you need to be aware of that if you want to keep on going.
Yeah, I once listened to Pomp ask you about a year ago in reference to a Paul Graham essay, Learning How to Unlearn, about that process. Well, I want to give you the chance to sum up our conversation and to tell our audience, our new audience on Unstuck, carrying over from our prior work and all of the things that we do at Gumroad, where to find you, Anna, and what you're most excited about moving forward here in the next year and on to 2022. And I understand there is a special surprise that you might be cooking up.
Yeah. So you can find me at Anna Fabrega 11 on Twitter, Miss Fab's Learning Lab on Instagram, where I'm getting started. I'm also on YouTube, where I'm putting also some of repurposing. We need to talk about that next time, the power of repurposing your content. I'm repurposing my content to video, sharing some there. I have my website, afabrega.com. And yeah, so after, I've been writing now for almost 2 years, and I have all this body of work that keeps getting shared. And I thought that now it's the good time to write a book. So I haven't actually shared this publicly. So this is the first time I'm saying this, but I'm very excited. I've been working for the past few months, and I'll keep on working for the following months on a book, sort of a compilation of my best write-ups with a twist, and then sharing a lot of this journey. And it's going to be applicable for adults, but again, always through that lens of a child. So yeah, I think the process has been a little bit easier for me than for people that are starting a book from scratch because of this whole writing. So yeah, this is